our next speaker, Dr. Paul Patton, who has a PhD in neurophysiology and is currently doing a second PhD at the HPS University of Toronto. Paul has been a member of our little group since 2016 and editor-in-chief of the encyclopedia that we have, and also one of the editors of the journal, and overall a very good friend and a walking encyclopedia himself, a repository of all sorts of knowledge about history of science. So Paul, take it from there.
Okay, and this work was done in collaboration with Cyrus Al-Zayadi, and the topic that I'm going to talk about is scientific disciplines and the Scientonomic ontology. Okay, first let me talk a little bit about the plan of this talk. I'm going to start by telling you why it is that we need a shared ontology of entities and relations in order to study the process of scientific change. I'm going to then give a brief overview of the current state of the Scientonomic ontology that has been constructed by a group of people here at the University of Toronto. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how we incorporate the concept of scientific disciplines into that ontology. Okay, so we'll start with why we need a shared ontology. Okay, so in many scientific fields, of course, in most scientific fields, there are journal publications are the main venue for scientific knowledge, but then they're also stored in databases. So we can take the narratives found and the data found in individual papers and combine them into databases, like in this case, the Tree of Life project, which is a project in taxonomy. And here's another example. This is the NASA IPAC Extragalactic Database. This is a database of galaxies and their properties that's used for cosmological purposes. Now, in order to make these databases, we need to have a way of taking all the individual narratives and combining them. So we need a standard ontology that's shared, standard shared ontology to make sense of all these narratives and turn the contents of the narrative into data. Okay, so in the case of the Tree of Life, we need a biological ontology concerning things like the definition of species. Okay, in the case of the cosmological database, we need an understanding of galaxies and the different kinds of galaxies, the cosmological redshift and the expansion of the universe. We need a standard ontology to make sense of all those thousands of papers. Okay, so we aspire, as integrated HPS aspires to create something similar, a database of intellectual history. By doing that, we hope to find global patterns in the process of scientific change. But in order to do that, we need the same sort of thing as we need for these other databases. We need a standard ontology. Now, that poses special problems in the case of the history and philosophy of science, because the history of science has no standard shared ontology. Let me give you an example. This is a passage about Sir Isaac Newton's work and its acceptance. It's about stances toward Isaac Newton's theories. Okay, so let's look at this. Here it says, Newton's work commanded the greatest of scientific authority. Newton largely reigned supreme. Newton's shadow fell more lightly in some other fields. There was without a firm commitment to Newtonian concepts. There's an equivocal attitude. There is rejection, debt, hegemony. So we have all these different ways of characterizing the status, the stances toward Newton's theory. Okay, in order to put this into a database, we need to find a way of standardizing this. Okay, and so one major goal of the Scientonomy group is to formulate and justify a standard ontology, making it possible to extract data from historical narratives. Okay, so an ontology is a theory concerning the entities and relations that populate a certain domain. What we mean by a Scientonomic ontology is an ontology of epistemic entities and relations relevant to the process of scientific change. Okay, so now, having told you why we need shared ontology, I want to give you a brief survey of the ontology that's been created by the Scientonomy group. And you've gotten a little bit of this yesterday in Grace's talk. I'm going to take a sort of a different spin on it. Okay, so there are two kinds of entities in our two kinds of basic epistemic elements. Those are questions and theories. A theory is understood as an attempt to answer a question. A theory is taken to be a set of propositions, okay, that answer a question. Each theory is an attempt to answer at least one question. They can answer many questions. Each question can have any number of attempted answers, not any number of theories. A question can presuppose any number of theories. A theory can be presupposed by any number of questions. Okay, so now this gives a very, very broad framework that allows one not only to characterize the theories of modern science, but almost any belief system about the natural world and perhaps about other things as well. Then let me give you an example. This example will not be taken from modern science. It will be taken from Aristotelian scholasticism. And let's consider a question. What is the distance between the Earth and the sphere of fixed stars? That question presumes certain theories. One of those theories is that the Earth exists. The other theory is that the sphere of stars exists. Those theories, again, are answers to certain questions. The question, does the Earth exist? And does the sphere of stars exist? Okay, so this shows you how this system can be applied even to pre-modern belief systems. Okay, so now we need to talk about agents and their stances that they can take toward these theories. Okay, one stance toward a theory is the stance of acceptance. An agent accepts a theory when they take it as the best available description of its domain. A theory pursuit is an epistemic agent can find a theory worthy of pursuit, worthy of further development. There are stances toward questions as well. Question acceptance is when an epistemic agent takes a question as a legitimate topic of inquiry. And question pursuit is when an epistemic agent finds a question pursuit. Okay, so now we need to talk about the kinds of theories. Okay, there are several different kinds of theories. There's theories that are definitions, theories that are descriptive theories that describe something, that are a set of propositions that describe something. And then finally, there are normative theories, a set of propositions that prescribe something. Now, in science, there's a special sort of normative theory, namely a method of theory assessment. And then we can talk about another kind of stance besides acceptance of theories and questions or pursuit of theories and questions. We can talk about employment. An employment of a norm is when you actually follow the norm, when you actually make use of it. Okay, so now having looked at epistemic stances and epistemic elements, now we can take a look at the agents that take those stances. Okay, we can define an epistemic agent as an agent capable of taking epistemic stances toward epistemic elements. What does that mean? Well, it means that such an agent has to have the ability to understand propositions and to compare a theory with its alternatives with reason and for the purpose of generating new knowledge. Okay, that means the sorts of systems that can do that, AI in its current state probably can't. Human beings, if they're properly trained and educated, can do that. So we can admit human individuals as epistemic agents. And finally, we can also take that there are most likely communal epistemic agents. Now, a communal epistemic agent is an epistemic agent that has its own stance that's not simply the aggregate of the individuals that make it up. Okay, and you can think of ways that a community can be organized such that the stance belongs to the community rather than to the individuals. Okay, and so now the question is, what knits all these agents together? Okay, and this is this is the system of authority delegation that allows for an epistemic division of labor. Epistemic agent A is delegating authority over topic X to epistemic agent B. If agent A accepts that B is an expert on question Q, and agent A accepts that an answer Q if B says so. Okay. So now this allows different agents to take on different areas of specialization and to work together in a division of epistemic labor. Okay. So now I've given you a brief overview of the current state of the Scientonomic ontology as formulated by our group. Now I'm going to talk specifically about how it is that we can incorporate disciplines into this ontology. Okay. So first of all, let's look a little bit about how social scientists think of disciplines. They usually think of them as disciplinary communities. Disciplinary communities are devoted to the production of new knowledge, and they're a distinctly modern phenomena. They started in 18th and 19th century Europe when natural science faculties arose in universities, and disciplinary communities devoted to the production of knowledge in specific fields were formed. Now, the Scientonomic ontology aspires to universality. We want to be able to make a comprehensive database of intellectual history. So we need to look for something broader than that this is a special case of. And I think there is there is something broader, and that's the practice of dividing knowledge into classes or categories is a universal feature of knowledge. Plato divided knowledge up into categories. Prior to the 18th century, distinct areas of knowledge were identified and classified primarily to organize teaching, instruction, and writing. So we can find, in that sense, we can find disciplines throughout across the intellectual history and across intellectual cultures. Okay, so in a database of intellectual history, then this should record the views of various agents on disciplinary divisions, such as agent A accepted discipline D at time T. Okay, so what exactly do we mean by that? Well, okay, let's look at a proper notion of discipline and how it relates to our accepted categories of question and theory. Okay, now, if we consider how questions, the questions that make up, say, an agent's belief system, an agent's mosaic, those aren't just a random assortment of questions. Questions are organized. Some questions are sub-questions of other questions. A question is a sub-question of another question if a direct answer to that question is a partial answer to the broader question. Okay, so with that insight, we can now think of questions as forming hierarchies. And here's an example of a question hierarchy: a general question, who are the rulers of Russia? A more specific question, who were the emperors of Russia? It was a sub-question of that question. And then, was Peter the Great an emperor of Russia? Is a more specific question. Here's an example from evolutionary biology of a hierarchy of questions. Here's a sub-question of the question of how did species originate as a result of evolution. And here's a highly specialized sub-question of within that hierarchy. So questions are not just a random assortment. They can be thought of as forming hierarchies, organized hierarchies. Given that insight, we can now ask where do we find disciplines in relation to these hierarchies? Okay, and the answer is that there are certain questions that are distinctive, definitive of a discipline, and those questions we call the discipline's core questions. So, and a discipline is characterized by its core questions. They're at the top of the hierarchy of any given discipline. And finally, we can think of a delineating theory, a theory accepted by some agent, second order theory that identifies a set of core questions of the discipline. So in order for an agent to accept the delineating theory, they accept that discipline exists. Okay. Okay, so here is then our example, that our hierarchy of questions in evolutionary biology. And here then is a core question of evolutionary biology. How did living species originate as a result of evolution? This is essential to the discipline. If that question wasn't there, it wouldn't be evolutionary biology. Okay, so now having identified core questions and given you an example, we can now define what a discipline is. We can define a discipline as characterized by 1, a non-empty set of core questions Q, and 2, a delineating theory stating that Q and the core questions are a discipline. So this is how we break it down. This is how we explain discipline in terms of questions and theories. Okay, so a discipline and its delineating theory have a one-to-one relationship. You only need one delineating theory that specifies the core questions for a discipline. Many questions can be part of a discipline. A discipline includes at least one question. And that question can be part of a number of disciplines. Those hierarchies that we talked about cross over one another. And a discipline can include any number of theories. A theory can be part of any number of disciplines. Okay. Now let's look at how do other questions besides the core questions become part of a discipline? Well, here all sub-questions of the core question also fall within the scope of the discipline. While sub-questions are contained within a discipline, they are not essential to it. In other words, as long as this question stays, how did living species originate as a result of evolution? This is the field of evolutionary biology. These sub-questions are constantly changing, but they are sub-questions of this core question. Okay, so now how do theories relate to this system? Okay, well, we can define a core theory of a discipline is a theory presupposed by the discipline's core questions. And I'll give you an example what that means. Here is our hierarchy of questions in evolutionary biology again. Here's our core question, how did living species originate as a result of evolution? And here's our core theory. Okay, this question presupposes that living species originated as a result of evolution. So this is now a core theory of the discipline. Other theories. Okay, so this theory belongs to the discipline if it's presupposed by the discipline's core questions. And then other theories that answer core questions or sub-questions, okay, are also part of the discipline. Okay, so now we've defined what a discipline is in terms of our standard ontology and how we might go about identifying disciplines in the literature of the history of science. Now, what do we mean when we say a discipline is accepted by an agent? Okay, so we have a delineating theory, core question, and to accept a discipline is not sufficient to accept its delineating theory alone. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Okay, an agent should also accept the core questions of the discipline. Well, why is that? Okay, here's an example. Astronomers accept that a discipline called astrology exists. They accept that its core question is how do the positions of the planets at the time of one's birth influence one's character. Okay, they accept the delineating theory of astrology, but they don't accept its core questions. Okay, so that's how we distinguish acceptance of a delineating theory from acceptance of the discipline itself. Okay, so here's our definition of discipline acceptance. A discipline is accepted by an epistemic agent if that agent accepts the core questions specified in the discipline's delineating theory, as well as the delineating theory itself. Okay, so now we're in a position to say how we would take information from a historian and put it into our database. Okay, so what this means is that agent A accepted the delineating theory for theory T at time T. Agent A accepted core question Q1, accepted core question Q2, etc. So we can break down the acceptance of a discipline into these questions, and we can look at the historical record and then cast this diverse narrative into a standard set of ideas. Okay, so now let's summarize the takeaway points of this. So when we're recording historical claims concerning disciplines on a database of intellectual history, the following things need to be considered. First, a discipline is characterized by a non-empty set of core questions and the delineating theory stating that Q are the core questions of the discipline, those two things. A question is part of a discipline if that discipline's delineating theory identifies it as a core question, or if it is a sub-question of that core question. A theory is part of a discipline if it is presupposed by the core questions, or if it provides at least a partial answer to the core questions of a discipline. A discipline is said to be accepted by an epistemic agent when the agent accepts both the delineating theory and the core questions. Okay, and so those are the criteria we posit need to be met to include a discipline in a database. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much, Paul. Very illuminating. Any questions? Nicola.
Thank you for this great talk. Actually, I have a question about the choice of questions as basic epistemic entities, because I was thinking about the late Ian Hacking's historical ontology and its stress on candidates for falsehood or truth within the context of a given style of scientific reasoning, and I was wondering.
So
why
in that sort of an approach, since theories are the only things that are candidates for truth or falsehood, you would say theories are fundamental. Well, in this case, questions are. If we take every theory to be an answer for a question, we can treat questions as fundamental. I think that in some sense there's an element of arbitrariness, but certainly it's possible to cast it that way. And that seems to be a way, making questions the backbone of the system seems to be a way of making it work. Now, whether it's the only way to make it work, I'm not sure. I initially tried to make it work in terms of theories, but I think we could make it work either way.
Just to add on to that, so initially in our ontology, we had theories and methods as the two fundamental entities. And then we soon came to realize two things. First, methods are not fundamental because they are just species of normative theories. They're just norms telling how we should act and whatnot. So you can formulate them as normative propositions. And second, when we started putting together our own encyclopedia, which can be thought of as a mini database of our own belief systems about that, when we try to organize it, we realized that it's not just theories that we have to enter. We also have to somehow connect these theories to something. For instance, what if we have two competing answers to the same question? And then it occurred to us, wait a second, we forgot about questions. And the reason why questions are fundamental is because you can easily accept a question without accepting any specific answer to that question. And scientists do that all the time. These are the open questions that we have. And also, given what erotic logicians tell us and formal semanticists tell us, questions as entities are not reducible to theories. They presuppose theories. They are described through their answerhood conditions, meaning what makes something a question is to understand the question implies to understand what sort of thing would count as an answer to it, but you don't need to have any specific answer to that to understand the question. So therefore, essentially, like semantically, it's just a different entity. And they come together, they are a pair. So it works very nicely that way. If that makes any sense. James?
Yeah, thanks for that talk. I only kind of discovered this Scientonomy ontology project this week, and it is really fascinating to think about. So it was nice to have that overview here. I'm going to make one observation and then ask a question. The observation is in the biological, biomedical ontologies that I work with, they are not necessarily as principled and upfront about everything as you might think. So the gene ontology doesn't define a gene, and the NCBI taxonomy, which is our main ontology of taxa, doesn't define taxa or species and doesn't even attempt to. And so we get by without those fundamental definitions in a lot of cases. Anyway, so and then there's a lot of databases that are started, like IDB was started without any strong ontological commitments, and then it kind of grew into these things, making different commitments, but they're always driven by the data that needed to be captured and kind of competency questions that drove the project, that we need to be able to do these kinds of analyses. We need to answer these kinds of questions based on the data. And then our ontological commitments kind of grew out of that. That's just an observation. And then my question specifically about the presentation is if there's kind of lower or upper limits to the kind of size of the questions or theories. It seems like what you presented, you could have tiny disciplines of like one person and one tiny theory about one tiny question. And then the scope could get very large. So that was my comment and my question.
Think of how many propositions if you wanted to cast something like evolutionary theory and just go the origin of species, trying to cast it as a series of propositions. It's something that's doable in principle, but it would be hard. And that's, so this recognition is that there are hierarchies of questions and so forth, gives the theory some structure and leads us toward understanding how a complicated theory like Darwin's theory of evolution could be understood in this context. But we're still working on things like that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks again.
And also to another comment on what James said previously, we also came to realize that an ontology does not necessarily require definitions of the terms included in the ontology. So even if you analyze an ontology by applying question-answer system, ontological claims are existence claims. They are claims that there is such a thing as species. As long as we agree that there is such a thing as species, and we have a reasonably more or less way of recognizing one when we see one, or something along those lines. You don't even need an agreed upon definition of what it is. Similarly for everything else. For a planet, you don't need a really agreed upon definition to have a database. It's great if you have one, that makes the disagreement, reduces the disagreement, but two agents can agree that X exists without agreeing on the definition of X. So that's a common thing. So it's just a comment. And obviously you need to agree on the existence claims, but not necessarily on definitions. Yes, Paul.
So in our case, an epistemic element is something we don't have a definition for, but we have an example of two different things, theories and questions that are epistemic elements. So yeah. Now I'd imagine in the example that James mentioned of the gene, I would imagine there's probably going to be problematic cases and those are going to force a definition of gene, just like the problematic case of Pluto and Eris forced to define what a problem.
Yeah, I guess my point is that scientists live with tensions and contradictions like this, even when they make philosophers very uncomfortable. So there's plurality and multiplicity inside the big ontologies that I work with, and they move over time, and communities shift what they actually accept and don't accept, even within these projects. Yep, it's pretty fascinating.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you very much, Paul. Another round of applause.